Yeah, my name's Peter Lee. I'm a reader in collaborative planning at the University of Birmingham and one of the co-investigators with Vlad on the 3S Recipe project. Now, whilst the 3S Recipe project was running, we also, or I also had with colleagues at the University of Birmingham and the City Council in Birmingham, a project called Use It, which is unlocking social and economic innovation together. So some of the ideas for 3S Recipe and some of the ideas for Use It were coming together around the concept of resilience and resilience thinking. And I've been writing around resilience in the run-up to the application for the JPI Urban project and for this project, Urban Innovative Actions project, Use It. So the ideas that I'm going to present today are kind of a fusion of both the Use It project and the 3S Recipe project, and thinking around some of the solutions that we might develop in the context of urban shrinkage, but also in the context of urban transformation and expansion. And one of the things that was coming out, I think, across all the partner cities was the role of universities and the role of higher education in stimulating growth and in a kind of a smart shrinkage solution to the problems that all of the cities has experienced. And in fact, yesterday, we're here at the Rep today in the centre of Birmingham. Yesterday we were in Stoke at Staffordshire University talking about the role of Staffordshire University in terms of connected communities and connecting the city of Stoke to opportunities. So I want to talk about resilience thinking generally, and resilience was clearly at the forefront of the thinking around 3S Recipe. And this book in particular, Urban Resilience, which I co-wrote with John Kofi back in 2016, was one of the key texts in thinking through smart shrinkage solutions and thinking about resilience of policies to different shock events. And clearly today we're talking in the context of an ongoing shock event, which is the coronavirus. And I think one of the principles that I'm going to draw out of this presentation is the need for evolutionary thinking in resilience terms and not hardwired kind of equilibrium approaches, engineering solution approaches, which is probably at the heart of some of the problems that we had with the methodology. And some of the conclusions I'm going to draw from are a reflection on the methodology and a reflection of the appropriateness of resilience methodologies in this context. Okay, so this is one of the key texts which was driving the driving the 3S Recipe project, but also driving the Use It project. And I think that it's also important, especially in a British context. You know, we had 7 cities. In a British context, the ideas that were formulating when we were writing the JPI Urban project, when Vlad was leading on that, but the ideas that were forming in the background, both for that bid, but also for the Use It bid, were, you know, resilience, austerity, about riots that happened in the UK in 2011. Brexit clearly was a really important component of this, not in the writing of the bids, but in terms of the response and in terms of our thinking, in terms of policy responses. Resources was a key aspect of our thinking in resilience, and I'll come back to that in terms of redundancy. And universities as anchors, as mechanisms to leverage resources for communities in the context of shrinkage or in urban transformation. And what I'm working towards here is kind of a more of a teaching, research, civic, business kind of nexus with the anchor universities at the heart of that. So at the end I'll try to draw out some lessons in terms of Use It and 3S Recipe. I'm not going to emphasize this in great detail, but you know, everybody who might be watching this can kind of is probably familiar with Gunderson and Holling's adaptive cycle and equilibrium. I suppose that the key thing here is the ability of regional systems, of city systems in all our cities about returning to some kind of equilibrium. And I think that what we, I suppose, have been reflecting on in the context of Stoke and in the context of the UK is something like Brexit is almost kind of a lament, a sort of a nostalgia for the past and a desire to return to something that is no longer available. And that's probably part of the background discourse around resilience and how it relates to cities like Stoke is perhaps, there's a kind of Brexit was a sort of both a message to policymakers and to politicians that you're not listening to us, but there's also a sort of desire to return to something that is not available. And I think returning to this later on, it's important to keep in mind that these equilibrium, adaptive models are kind of from engineering and ecological disciplines rather than from the social sciences. And clearly in an urban and regional context, it's very difficult to return to something that's gone. The relevance of resilience to planning and what we're doing with 3S Recipe and with Use It is about kind of community and about the capability of social systems to return to some kind of normality. And often communities are obviously at the forefront of that, and the ability of communities to respond and be capable of responding to shock events. And at the moment, in the coronavirus, as that kind of shock unfolds, I think that what's happening is government talking about local and community-led responses as being part of the solution and part of the way in which we kind of return to some kind of equilibrium. And clearly that's appropriate in a biological and an ecological kind of sense. But the problem, I suppose, for in terms of social sciences is the criticism that has been about resilience is it's a responsibilizing, disciplining concept. It kind of locates the source of resilience as lying within the scale in question, so it responsibilizes those communities, responsibilizes those cities to develop solutions, which, the problem is lying at a completely different scale, at a global scale, etc. And we tend to be using kind of the concept of resilience for different types of shocks. Are the same kind of analytical governance sort of mechanisms and responses the same for both anthropogenic and kind of natural shocks? Is it the same for short-term shocks or slow burn shocks? We know again and again through history that when there is a change in circumstances and when there's an emergency, often those emergency powers get used in the normalization of social policies. We've seen that with things like the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So, there is a danger I suppose, in an equilibrium response about inserting emergency powers into the normalization of society generally. So I want to return to the kind of concept of universities as anchors and austerity and about the kind of context in which the UK was operating from the early 2010s. And the Use It project stemmed from the repurposing of an urban regeneration renewal module and sort of seeing the students as a resource. And we had at the University of Birmingham an enormous range of students coming from different backgrounds, coming from previous careers in architecture, say in Brazil or in Turkey. We have to see this as a valuable resource within a renewed civic business knowledge nexus. Rather than passive agents taking information, we need to kind of view our students as a valuable resource within the city. So a number of our students developing on this course contributed policy ideas which were taken up by the hospital in a large regeneration project. And this is one of the projects that was developed as part of this module. We scaled this up into a project, the project Use It. But I think the other aspect I want to draw out here is about agents can be part of the shock, and that's very different in ecological systems or in engineering systems. And here in the city of Birmingham, we're right in the middle of what was the civic kind of heart of Birmingham. We've got a legacy of agents of Cadbury, of Chamberlain, of Unwin, who was the first planning lecturer at the University of Birmingham, building a legacy which was has built kind of resilience into the city. So agents can be kind of positive shock, agents can be very negative in terms of shock. But agents can be, when that shock is negative, in terms of their shared normative and principled beliefs or causal beliefs or in terms of notions of validity, can result in very negative outcomes. So, taking all that together, I want to develop a kind of a premise around some ideas about evolutionary kind of thinking on resilience, and how the 3S recipe and the Use It project have come together in terms of thinking around resilience thinking. And I think the first point is about this kind of idea of complexity and inclusion. Dealing with the sorts of problems in terms of shrinkage requires incrementalist approaches and context-driven approaches. And all of the cities, I think we can say that they were incrementalist and they were context-driven. They weren't necessarily all driven by large strategic interventions, but there was, especially in Stoke, a very incrementalist approach. Resilience thinking requires these three components about redundancy and substitution to underpin resilience thinking. It requires an evolutionary approach, that's about adaptation versus adaptability. It's not about an equilibrium approach, about returning to something that's gone, and it's about collaboration. And so I want to emphasize universities as kind of global actors and with a public and social good role, and emphasize the need for new mechanisms in this kind of renewed civic knowledge nexus. Okay, I'll skip through this fairly quickly in terms of the references, but there's a long tradition in public policy of incrementalism. This goes back to Charles Lindblom, back to the 1950s, and talks about a kind of the difference between a sort of incrementalist versus a very technical, rationalist approach to developing public policies. So there's a developed literature there. I think in terms of urban and regional systems, there is a tendency in the resilience discourse towards responsibilizing. I've already emphasized that. And this kind of criticism about the decentralized and resilient processes of nature being applied to social and economic systems is inappropriate at times. And I'll refer to some of our case study projects that Vlad and I have been doing over a number of years to draw out that problem of decentralized and resilient process of nature and how it's inappropriate. So adaptability and integrated planning in Japan. This is one of the projects that we've been involved in, and I think that when you have a very hardwired planning system which is very equilibrium focused, necessarily in a context of Japan where you want an engineering response, because Vlad and I have been in Japan whilst an earthquake was happening, and when you're on the 10th or 12th floor and the building is swaying around, you want that building to be designed by engineers and not by social scientists. So, very rightly, we have an equilibrium response to sudden shock events like earthquakes or tsunamis, volcanoes, etc. But the problem with an equilibrium approach is that it can become very centralized, bureaucratic, and favor particular actors in that epistemic community at the expense of the local community. And it can result in some outcomes which are maybe unintended, or which lock the city, the region, or the area into a path dependency and lock it into a particular form of development. And this is what this project was revealing, to be written up in terms of, we've got a number of papers. One of our contributors to the 3S recipe, Junichiro Asano-san, is one of our collaborators in Japan. So this is post 2011, so 9 years ago, almost to the day. This is Japan's idea of building redundancy into housing stock, that you build housing on stilts so that it can withstand tsunami. But clearly this was a tsunami that was 1 in a 400-year event. And so it kind of was unprecedented for this region, apart from 400 years ago when Hokusai did the Great Wave. So it was something within recorded human history. And this is Kesanuma in 2013. The area has been completely rebuilt. The ship has been returned back to the sea, or to the scrapyard, I think. But this was a triple disaster. There was a failure in terms of acknowledgement that this was a problem in terms of locating a nuclear power plant on the most geologically unstable country in the world. And it was, in terms of the epistemic community and what I was talking before about agents, Japan failed to acknowledge that the technically, we shouldn't be locating nuclear power plants here. That was an age-old problem of America wanting to have fissile material on Japan's shores. But Japan wants to sell its nuclear technology to other countries, so it just said that it was a failure of Japanese culture. So there's a sort of an epistemic community there with shared values, wanting to protect its decision-making. And I suppose that one of the issues about the triple disaster is the invisibility and the scale of the shock. And the problem is that the community gets responsibilized for that. The problems lie elsewhere at different scales in time and space. Japan's approach in terms of that, to kind of get back to some kind of equilibrium, very technical, very rational, about land readjustment, about building seawalls, concrete seawalls, 7.5 meters high. This was Kesennuma in 2013. You can see Kesennuma in 2015, where the seawall is being built to a much higher scale. And this is a picture of Kesennuma in 2018 when Vlad and I visited, and you can see the scale at which the walls are being built. And these are right across most of the eastern seaboard of Japan. So here we have probably the concrete, the building companies, the concrete manufacturers, etc., benefiting from that nexus of the bureaucrats, business, centralized government in the Diet, deciding an equilibrium approach is to return back something that was there before, when actually this is a shrinking region. This is a shrinking part of Japan. Population has been declined for a number of years. You're not going to get population coming back, and you're certainly not going to be able to implement the kind of chitta slow, alternative sort of lifestyle kind of economy and tourism when you've built massive walls to obscure the beautiful vista of the sea on this particular part of Japan. A very beautiful part of Japan, which is obviously being destroyed in terms of the relationship between nature and the communities. So what we want to see is more redundancy in the system, building good quality at the start of the process, and that's a key aspect of resilience and what should be at the heart of our resilience thinking. And part of that redundancy is about substitutability. We've got a picture here, which is the Spode Works, where we were yesterday. And the ability and the diversity, this is a building that has got quality built into it. It's a fantastic space. It's useful for hosting lots of different events. And there's some kind of substitutability and some diversity ability and adaptation ability built in to this building. So elements, systems, or other units of analysis exist that are substitutable, and this is a good example of the way in which the building can support other uses and adaptations. The concept of redundancy in social sciences is often seen as negative. Classically, 1979 election, when the Conservative Party talked about, it's seen as surplus value, seen as a negative thing. But there's a lot of literature now saying build at the start of the process, build good quality, it will last. If you go on the Shinkansen in Japan, the quality of the materials, the quality of the infrastructure is built to last, and there are trains running on that network which are more than 50 years old. So we have to build into that system. The key aspect of redundancy is about adaptability versus adaptation. Are we just adapting something to make it fit to the equilibrium, or is it adaptability to take it forwards and kind of like bounce forwards in terms of that kind of evolutionary resilience? So here's an example of where redundancy in the planning system is not being built, where you've got that confluence of global financial gain through the exploitation of resources, a political elite and a nexus agents of shock who decide that they want to do something good for working class people at the expense of not consulting with those people and actually thinking through the policy implementation and not thinking through an evolutionary kind of way how the resources could be used in a way that underpins long-term resilience and long-term sustainability. So here, this is a project where we went to Brazil in 2015 and 2016, and this was not the kind of sexy beachside football playing part of Brazil that everybody's familiar with. Because this is about shrinking cities, we were visiting some of the middle cities where population was declining. Because you have a system of capitalism which is highly rapacious, it moves on to the next bit of land to exploit in a classic pattern of kind of clearance of natural resources to exploit the wood. Then you would have coffee plantations, then you have ranching, and then the population moves on, not building any diversity or substitutability or building any kind of regeneration and renewal legacy. So what's this? This is the railroad in President Prudence, which is a shrinking city. And in President Prudence, they closed the railway. So you cannot get from the equivalent of Stoke to Manchester on the train. You can't get from the equivalent of Stoke to Birmingham on the train. You have to fly. Now, these are relative distances, so you might have to fly from President Prudence to Londrina, which is a distance, I don't know, about 150 kilometres, or you drive. Now, the reason that they closed the railway is because they sold the railway, they sold it to the freight company. The railway was competing with the freight company, so the freight company shut down the railway so that everything goes on the road. Here we have a picture of Mia Casa Mia Vida, My Home, My Life, which is a national project which was fueled by that Brazil was a very cash-rich economy over that, building enormous reserves in terms of exploitation of natural resources, a left-wing government wanting to build housing for working class people, and especially in terms of slum clearance. This policy was about a lottery, drawing people from lots of different slums across the city, bringing them into a community which was very peripheral with no real services, and putting them into large communities like this with no services, no connection to jobs, etc. People start to develop their own mechanisms of transport, their own mechanisms of exchange, etc. There is no redundancy, no real quality or diversity ability built into this system. Here we are in 2015. We can see the type of housing that's being built, incredibly poor quality, probably better than the slums that it's replacing, very poor quality, but you can see that people are starting to self-segregate, building their own walls. We asked, why didn't you build some garden walls, some defensible space? They said they couldn't afford that, or it wasn't necessary, but people are starting to self-segregate, and the quality of that self-segregation is highly questionable. Okay, so that's an example of kind of where redundancy hasn't been built into the system. What I'm trying to argue here in terms of drawing lessons from 3S recipe and drawing lessons from use it is this need for sort of an evolutionary resilience response, which is context specific, but that can take us a little bit too kind of like into the particular. We need to also take into account the interaction of systems across time and space. Now, what we're finding with the example of Stoke is a panarchy, a kind of a failure of different systems interacting and us not adapting to that over time, because we didn't detect the fact that it was causing a significant problem at the time, because people have different strategies of investing in their housing or moving or whatever. And there are therefore time lags in the way in which that plays out. Now, I got involved in the Stoke, we were involved in the Stoke city because of the relationship with B Arts, but also because we'd been working on low demand and abandonment of housing back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I was working on Stoke around that time in terms of shrinkage and abandonment of housing. And here are some examples of abandonment in the northwest of England and in Yorkshire and in Stoke, different neighbourhoods, different time. It was in 2012 that I met Vlad, and we started to talk about kind of regional systems, regional planning, and about abandonment, and about our shared kind of interests in shrinking spaces and the work I'd done which led to housing market renewal. So I'm going to draw here just briefly a quick example of that kind of idea of panarchy and about different way in which systems interact. And I think the lesson here is the same whether it's for Stoke or whether it's for, in fact this is Stoke, I think this is the Stoke Sentinel in terms of a £2,000 house, somebody trapped in that £2,000 house, remembering that Thatcherism sold the idea of a property-owning democracy, but we had a number of people who were excluded because the market was failing them and they were trapped in housing that they'd bought many years earlier. So this is Stoke, trapped in a £2,000 house. This is the idea of passive revanchism, that kind of idea that agents of shock and that epistemic community coming together and actually neglecting whole communities. And this is a community in Yorkshire that was left behind because it lost its function, and also insurers and investors would not lend money on this housing because it was suffering from subsidence and close to mines. Similar processes going on in Stoke. So going back to the resilience book, there's a chapter in the book on the case of Liverpool. I think some of the lessons from Liverpool are equally applicable to Stoke in terms of the failure of regional planning and a failure to diversify the economy, failure in terms of adaptation of housing, an expansion of higher education, which led to the adaptability of housing and a new cohort of people coming in, welfare changes, changes in household behaviour, fragmented governance leading to abandonment. And these are all the kind of classic things that happened in Liverpool. Just to take one or two problems that emerged, a reinvention of housing markets conceals the problem. So we had a reinvention in Liverpool where there was abandonment, with people moving out to the Wirral and a loss of jobs. The expansion of higher education actually concealed the problem, but landlords didn't really invest in property, but just moved to a new client group. Housing benefits also affected that because it actually meant investment in benefits rather than investment in bricks and mortar. All that's laid out in the chapter in the Resilience and Planning book. Okay. So now the other premise that I was talking about in terms of resilience thinking and the need for collaboration, co-design and leadership. And I've got a number of references here to people like Henry Lefebvre, to Patsy Healy and to others in terms of the need for a collaborative, evolutionary approach to planning and urban transformation. And finally, trying to make that link over, which is coming out in all the 3S recipe case studies, is the role of higher education, role of institutions in that evolutionary approach to resilience, and the need for anchor institutions like universities to play a leading role in that. Now, what I would argue though is that there is a sort of a paradox here, that whilst universities are in a good position to play that kind of role in terms of evolutionary resilience thinking and to create the capacity for a renewed civic business knowledge nexus, they're also kind of like the metrics by which they're measured make them face away from communities. So yesterday we were in Stoke and Staffordshire University opening a London campus. That's not speaking to the community in Stoke, that's clearly speaking to a community, beyond the Staffordshire and Stoke community, and necessarily it wants to bring some revenue in, it wants to insulate itself from any future risks, but a civic university has to compete against the fact that there's a valorisation of estates, maximising the value of estates. The metrics are to attract global talent rather than maybe local or regional. There's metrics to attract the market of students, and therefore there might be the case that all the metrics in terms of measuring league tables, in terms of outcomes, etc., make universities that are globally face away from the historical roots of their civic role. So in terms of universities and anchors and that kind of renewed nexus, we need some co-production to clarify those shared goals, but crucially we need some culture change in leadership of anchor institutions in order to ensure that that kind of renewed nexus is sustainable. Okay, so here I've emphasised that resilience thinking should obviously emphasise collaboration, co-production, etc. Evolutionary resilience and planning in Birmingham, I'll just quickly pass over this because it raises questions about resilience for whom. And after the riots, we did a number of interviews with people in peripheral estates who were saying that the city wasn't for them. Here we are in the Rep in Birmingham, in what was John Maidin's designed civic kind of centre for the university, but which is becoming a very corporate space. And we get a lot of people saying from our peripheral estates that they don't feel that the city is for them. So, you know, if we build in a very corporate way, we've got to be kind of sensitive to thinking about, you know, resilience for who. This is somebody saying that there's a very strong village mentality in one of the peripheral estates. A lot of elderly people still have not seen the bull ring. Okay, so all that and trying to work towards what does this kind of mean in terms of evolutionary thinking, in terms of the role of anchor institutions, in terms of universities, which has been a key policy solution in most of the 3S recipe cities. And here there's a sort of segue to the Use It project, Unlocking Social and Economic Innovation Together, which was a project that was running alongside 3S recipe for the last 3 years. I suppose a number of key words here in terms of collaborative planning, realist approaches, about capacity building, etc., which are key aspects of any solution in terms of shrinkage. It's a 3-year project, multi-partner, 15 partners, emphasising inclusive growth. Financialisation and globalisation was one of the things that we wanted to address. And it kind of worked on a hypothesis. We were working on a transect of Birmingham and Sandwell, focusing on a particularly poor part of the city, but where there was significant gentrification going on, and our hypothesis was that this would backfill back to the city centre over a period of time because of rent gap theory. Low rents and low land values in this particular part of the city region would result in some significant gentrification. These are some of the plans that Urban Splash had for this particular area. And hey presto, lo and behold, back in 2019, in March last year, the City Council at Birmingham announced that Ladywood was to be put on the World Property Stage, which is MIPIM. So the area has been put on the World Property Stage to get investors in, and there's going to be a process of regeneration over the next 10, 20 years. Okay, so what we're trying to do with Use It was to connect the existing poor community to the big urban transformations that were going on. A large hospital, the urban renaissance in the city centre, the potential now redevelopment of Ladywood because of putting Ladywood onto the MIPIM world stage. And these were some of our objectives. Trying to connect up these global processes to the local, and the university as an anchor to facilitate that relationship between local communities and these global processes. These are some of the impacts we've had. There were 3 significant work packages, one on skills matching. We wanted to use community researchers to go into these poor communities to identify people with particular skills that weren't being recognised and connect them to opportunities in the hospital that was being created. We said we'd identify 60 people, we identified about 250. We wanted to train community researchers to build a kind of a cadre, an army of people who could carry out research. And we did this and developed a number of projects, which we've got a number on display in this room today. One of them has leveraged another £300,000 for the city. This is community research related work. Had a number of impacts on the NHS, with the NHS developing a programme called Health Overseas Professionals, which is being rolled out, which is the way in which the hospital and the NHS as an anchor institution connects to its local communities. And again, this is just more media on this initiative for Health Overseas Professionals. So the community research aspect of this was about training and developing people's skills, empowering them, making them feel that they were part of that collaborative planning process, and there's a link which to the Use It UIA website, which I'm not going to press on it now, but there's a set of videos which tell more about this process. And this is a very incremental approach. In bids like 3S Recipe to JPI Urban and to the Urban Innovative Actions programme, you write the bid, you say that you're going to deliver these outputs, but along the way you actually discover that that's not working, so you do something else. You have an incremental approach, and that's what we did within Use It. We kind of said, well, that aspect of Use It's not working, let's move to a commissioning research model. We want to create an anchor out of community engaged research. And what we did with our commissioning research model was we identified community researchers with interests, clients such as the Canal and Rivers Trust with a policy problem, and somebody in the university who could mentor those community researchers, and developed a number of research projects, which we commissioned, a number of research projects, a number of posters we have here explaining what those projects are. So, for example, local procurement in Soho Ward. It's about connecting up where there are procurement opportunities within the city to connect more locally. I'll just flash through these. Work with asylum seekers and refugees, projects looking at English as a second language, support for improving health, project which was about sanctuary, about using the skills of refugees to help new refugees integrate into the labour market. Developing a wild neighbourhood. We had a group of community researchers who were identifying patches of land within this transect where some urban wilding could take place. We had a health project on obesogenic environments and diabetes, and a canal adoption project, accessibility and walkability in the area given the gentrification that was going on, and a project around thinking about heritage and the industrial heritage, and conceptualizing this idea of Tate Industrial, which was based on the fact that we had a Turner Prize listed artist in the area who was going to bury an aeroplane, and so that stimulated quite a lot of ideas around well, what could this do in the longer term in terms of evolving some transformative processes. So out of this, and this is where I talk about an incrementalist approach, we didn't write into the bid that we would develop a community research social enterprise, this CRSE, with impact, with funding, with training and skills, but that's where we're heading. And we've partnered with Birmingham Voluntary Services Council. We've developed a community research model, delivery model for empowering peer-to-peer research, commissioning, and impacting on policy and on social value. And here we have a number of, this is a visual mechanism to animate collaborative planning and inclusive growth, and to develop that kind of evolutionary approach to resilience. So having a community research social enterprise, leveraged by the university in terms of knowledge, creating more visibility to access resources. It can underpin the co-production of knowledge, be a go-to place for strategic investments. We've got the Commonwealth Games here in Birmingham in 2022. If we'd had this community research social enterprise 5 years ago, we could go to them and say, okay, in Peribar, what assets do we have? How do we work with you together to kind of evolve our transformative projects that related to that kind of investment? We can develop a shared narrative of place and space rather than being areas being talked about by academics. We share that narrative. The places that, like Stoke, which are talked about, are left behind places, or places that don't matter. Those are narratives that are owned by academics. We want to have a shared narrative of place and space. We want to move from NIMBY to YIMBY, not in my backyard to yes in my backyard. If you're going to do that development, there needs to be some strings attached to that for us. What do we get out of that process? We want to have an additional resource for local communities. If we pay our community researchers £120 a day, that's better that money goes in terms of local economic development rather than paying outside consultants £200-300 a day and just parachuting in. And so this is a kind of a visible pathway for social mobility. It's a visible mechanism to engage in terms of corporate social responsibility, etc. We can have a larger role to play on influencing policy. That mechanism to animate corporate social responsibility, additional resources for the third sector, and we can bend new revenue streams. Community infrastructure levy, social value. There's lots of money flows through places like Stoke in terms of consultancy. If we have a visible mechanism, we can bend that funding into that vehicle. And so in terms of resilience thinking, we can tick the boxes in terms of, is it rescaled or is it discrete? Is it path dependent or path determined, etc.? Having this vehicle, this renewed knowledge nexus with communities can allow us to address some of these evolutionary resilience principles that I've kind of outlined in this presentation. So just revisiting that premise, I'm not going to go back through that, but that's what the premise was about in terms of, these are the key components that we need in terms of resilience and smart shrinkage solutions. We need a radical versus a conservative resilience approach, a radical incrementalism. It's got to be empowering. It's not just got to be incremental, building something, but it's got to be radical in terms of, how it actually distributes resources in a just and fair way. So, resilience is here to stay. We need to be guarded against the equilibrium models of resilience, which can be punitive. And we need to build redundancy into our systems, and we need to have an evolutionary resilience approach in terms of inclusive growth. So both use it, and the 3S recipe have demonstrated that adaptation and substitution requires evolutionary and incremental approaches. I've talked through a model that is kind of a proof of concept in terms of delivering some co-designed research and policy solutions. Universities can be part of that 3S recipe. All our partners have been talking about universities, but we need mechanisms. We need mechanisms to animate those evolutionary principles and to create an anchor out of community engaged research where you've got universities facing away. We can create a group of people that actually feel some ownership and be part of a team to deliver that kind of evolutionary transformative approach. Thank you very much.